Auf der Keynote Arena der Zukunft Personal 2018. Ich bin sicher, einige von Ihnen waren gestern schon hier. Wir hatten gestern schon tolle Speeches, die wir folgen konnten, die viel Input sowohl auf einer theoretischen Ebene als auch auf einer sehr praktischen Ebene für Sie bieten konnten. Es gibt ein paar technisch interessante Dinge, auf die ich Sie hinweisen möchte. Das erste ist, was ich noch nie auf einer vergleichbaren Veranstaltung gesehen habe, ist, dass wir Visual Recording live für Sie haben. Also, da sehen Sie, wie unsere wunderbaren Visual Recorder von Ferry Wastin und Fridolin den Vortrag unserer nächsten Speakerin selbst wahrnehmen, die Schwerpunkte visuell setzen. Und für diejenigen, die selbst gerne Sketchnotes nehmen, können sich da nochmal von Profis ein bisschen Inspiration holen. Das zweite ist, die anderen Slides, die sich direkt auf den Vortrag beziehen, die sind auf dieser Seite. Da können Sie das andere verfolgen. So viel der Vorrede. Ich muss noch was sagen. Unser nächster Vortrag ist in Englisch. Falls Sie sich ein bisschen sicherer fühlen beim Zuhören, mit einer englischen Übersetzung können Sie sich da so Audioteile abholen und das Ganze in der Live-Übersetzung verfolgen. So, das war's aber wirklich mit dem technischen Vorteil, denn natürlich geht es hier im Wesentlichen um die Inhalte and obviously we're going to switch into English now as our next speaker is born in Cologne but raised in Canada and is now working in London. We're really delighted that we have here one of the first and foremost people that call themselves memory hacker, which seems to be a new profession. I've never heard about it. She's going to explain exactly what that means. Our next speaker is a great speaker, TED speaker, for example, but she's also a book author. She's published a book that's called in German Das trügerische Gedächtnis, summing up very much of her scientific work. The English title is The Memory Illusion, which leads to the content of the upcoming talk. Our memory is a tricky thing. It helps us, as it says, to memorize things, but it can also be very, very dilutive. It can trigger ourselves. And technology, at some point, as clever as artificial intelligence will become in the upcoming years, might be able to foster our brain in order to get better, or to be more precise, more accurate memories. How that can work and what that means in a broader context, but especially for HR, will be explained by a great keynote speaker. I'm very glad she's here. Dr. Julia Shaw, memory hacker and psychological scientist at the University College of London, and as well a founder of a great startup. Julia, we are very glad you're here. Very welcome.
Hello, I'm very happy to be here, back almost in my hometown. My mom actually lives right across the Rhine. She lives in the Rheinauhafen. Wir könnten das jetzt auch auf Deutsch machen, aber weil wir so schön international hier sind, machen wir das jetzt auf Englisch. I'm really excited to be here in particular because my newest venture actually focuses on HR, so I talk to people like you on a regular basis now, which is a new thing for me. But memories, it turns out, are important not just for your daily lives, but also for your work. So let's start by covering the basics. What actually is memory? We use it every day, but do we really understand how it works? I mean, even if you think about what it means, what it feels like to remember, it can be a very different experience depending on what it is. But the memories that I find most interesting are what are referred to as autobiographical memories, or memories of your personal life. Memories that are full of emotion and that have what are called multi-sensory components. They have feelings, you can hear things, you can smell things, you can touch things, you can taste things. Now these multi-sensory memories are the memories that generally define us as human beings because they essentially build up our life story. They're your first childhood experience. They're the time your grandpa picked you up and threw you around and you got really excited. They're your first romance, your first job, your first promotion. These memories are complex and they have texture. But what do they actually look like in the brain? And how are they different from facts? Facts are flat. Facts don't have those multi-sensory components, and they generally don't have as much importance for your personal narrative, for your life story, for your identity. But these multi-sensory memories do. So first of all, what is a memory? We can start by realizing that memories are not just in one part of the brain. Memories are actually spread out, especially when we're talking about autobiographical memories, across different parts of the brain. So if you think about it as when you're activating a memory, you send out what's called a little probe. You say, I'm looking for childhood memory X. I'm looking for a memory of my last meeting. And you send that into the brain, and then what happens? What happens is that it sends out a ripple effect, and it looks for things that connect to that particular thing you've sent out. And so essentially what happens is what then is activated are all the different parts of that memory. So if you heard things in that event, that part of the brain that's responsible for hearing is activated. If you see things in the memory, if you have visual parts of the memory, the part of the brain that's responsible for sight is also recruited and part of the network that's involved in that memory. If you have various kinds of emotional things, those different parts are all recruited. And so memories don't just live in one part of the brain, like some other brain activities. Instead, they actually live as rather complex networks that can be part of lots of different areas of the brain. Now, if you've studied memory, you may have heard the word the hippocampus. The hippocampus is a little part of the brain, right in the middle, well, two parts really, that allegedly looks like a seahorse. So you can picture two little seahorses swimming in the middle of your brain. It doesn't actually look like that, but it helps you to remember. And the hippocampus is really important for memory, but it's only really involved, well, although there's some new literature that questions this, but it's only really involved in the first part, in deciding which memories to keep and deciding to turn short-term memories into long-term memories. At that point, they're across the brain. And the things that are connected, the parts of the brain that are connected, aren't just different sections of the brain, they're neurons. So memories you can conceptualize as interconnected neurons. And if we zoom out, we see memories as networks of neurons. And this network, if we zoom out further, becomes your reality. So if we think about how many neurons you actually have in your brain, you have as many brain cells as there are stars in the Milky Way galaxy. You have a huge amount of data in your brain that's all stored in these interconnected, small, tiny little pieces. And ultimately, when you think about these different networks and how they interface with each other, what you get is a representation of what you think is your reality. Well, you could even argue it is your reality, even if it's not factually accurate. So if you think back over your life, you might have a childhood or a terrible childhood.
You might think that you loved your first job or didn't love your first job. You might think that you deserve that promotion because remember all the great work that you've done. But maybe the facts don't quite correspond to what you're remembering. But to you, that's your reality and that's what matters most. Now, in terms of reality monitoring, there's a story that at some point, I don't know about you, but I don't come from a very educated family. I'm the first in my family to go to university, and it took a while for my family to understand what it is I actually do. So when I did a Bachelor of Arts, my grandma kept asking me for my painting. How's your painting going? Nope, grandma, nope. I did a master's in psychology and law, so suddenly my family thought I was becoming a lawyer, also no. I did a doctorate, right? My mom started asking me, "Hebt du was am Fuß?" Yeah, no, still no, not that kind of doctor. Anyway, I published my book, and finally my family understood what it is I actually study. And suddenly, the stories started coming. And you will notice this. If you start paying attention to memory errors in particular, when people get memories wrong, if you're sitting at a family table and you're sitting next to your sister or you're sitting next to your mom or your dad or whomever, you sometimes tell stories, and sometimes these stories are wrong. And then it becomes, why are you lying? Or why are you so wrong? Now, one of these stories is my Aunt Ilse, Tante Ilse, tells this story about when she was in Basel in Switzerland, and she's gone sightseeing during the day with my parents. Afterwards, they get into their car, they sit down, and they want to leave this parking garage to go home. They start to drive out. There's a man standing in front of them. He's talking to himself, and he's not moving out of the way. Now, instead of going, he just stands there. So she gets out of the car, my mom, and says, "Entschuldigen Sie, können Sie bitte aus dem Weg gehen?" And instead of going out of the way like a normal human being would, he runs at her. He pushes her into the car, and he starts to punch her. Now, my Aunt Ilse is in the back seat, and she can feel the sweat. She's terrified. Everyone's really excited. It's really emotional. And my dad drives away, and the perpetrator falls away, and my mom's okay. She's okay. But of course, this is a world-shaking event. Her worldview is questioned. No one in the family had ever been randomly assaulted before. So my aunt tells this story. You can practically feel the sweat off of the back of my mom's neck. You can practically smell the perpetrator. You can feel the emotionality. It's incredibly detailed. There's only one problem. She wasn't actually there. My aunt was not in the back seat when my mom was assaulted. Now, when you tell my aunt this and say, "Tante Ilse, du warst doch in Köln. You weren't in Basel, you were in Cologne." What does she say? "No, I remember it so clearly, I know I was there." Now, this is an impossible memory for my aunt, but because for her it's got so much texture, so much multi-sensory detail, it feels so real that even in the face of evidence that says this could not have happened, she continues to trust her own memory better. Why? Because we're all our own favorite experts. But the bigger question is, how did it get there in the first place? Probably what happened is that my mom told this story, like my aunt tells it now, full of emotion, full of multisensory details, so my aunt could picture it so well that she essentially at some point just put herself in the back seat. Because if she can remember all these details, she must have been there. Imagination is a really powerful way to get people to remember things that never actually happened. And what happened to my aunt is something that we refer to as a false memory. It's a memory of something that didn't actually happen to her. Now, since we're talking about technology here as well, how does AI have the potential to further influence our reality? There's a lot of talk about fake news and how potentially wrong information can influence what we think the world is like. I wrote a few articles out of a desperate effort to try and hinder Brexit. One woman's crusade. And essentially this rhetoric around make America great again, make Britain great again. These are all rhetorics that are alluding to a past that I'm pretty sure never existed. But if you talk about it enough and you make it beautiful and nostalgic, what happens? People remember it with you, and they remember it as probably more beautiful and greater than it actually was. So I think that false memories can threaten our political decision-making, and right now, technology, and the internet in particular, is having a unique and new influence on information that we're accepting into our brain and accepting into our reality. In terms of AI, well, even just the internet right now, you could, I think, picture yourself almost plugged in directly to a technological interface. I mean, you're essentially attached to your phone. It's probably physically on you right now. Now, this is great in the sense that you essentially have the world's knowledge in your pocket. Not that you're using it that way most of the time, probably. But you also have the ability to record things. You have the ability to take photos, or to write down memories, or to write down quotes, so that your brain, which might forget them, has sort of outsourced that particular task. Now, I think the actual visual of being plugged in and having a physical extension of your neural network in your brain with neural networks that exist in cyberspace, I think is actually a useful visualization. Because that's what's happening, and that's what's going to happen more over time, is we are using technology and AI to outsource things that our brains are not particularly good at. We already use it to outsource things like complex mathematical equations, because our brains don't compute things fast enough. But now I think we are also moving towards outsourcing increasingly memory. We use Facebook, we use Instagram, we use all these tools to document stuff so our brains don't really have to. And the neural network, when it comes to AI, can potentially change that and morph that and store things for us better. When we talk about simulation, I think one of the things that we sometimes forget is that even in this moment, your perception of this moment is different from the perception that your neighbor has. So if you were to close your eyes right now and tell me what this room looks like, you would get things wrong. You would forget things, you'd misremember things, you'd maybe not remember that, what color even is this, purple, blue? You might not remember that it's purple, that there's a woman in a pink wig behind me. And that's as good as your memory's ever going to get. And the reason why you're perceiving potentially different things than somebody else is that, I think it's because I went in front of the speaker, why you're potentially perceiving different things than someone else is also because your attention is different, your interests are different, your knowledge, your worldview are different. And so in the very moment, we're all perceiving a different reality. Now, think about how that might change in a day, in a week, in a year, in 20 years, in 50 years. Your memories don't really have a chance to be totally accurate. They start imperfect, and they just get more imperfect from there. And so ultimately, when you're remembering something, it's your personal simulation. It's your personal version of what your brain has been able to capture and retain over time, including social influence, including your experiences since the event. Oh, I want to watch this. So here's a video about some of my research that I think will hope to also explain how that simulation can be hacked and how we can actually implant false memories of important emotional experiences into others. Can we turn down the lights? Or no? Danke. Okay. I'm going to play a video. It's a few minutes, and then we'll talk about the research. It's over here.
Shaw has designed perhaps the most comprehensive study ever on false memory. She starts by recruiting over 100 people for what they think is a study about their childhood memories.
So this is my first meeting with the participant. The first event which we'll be talking about was the time when you were 12 and you moved from Trinidad to Kelowna. I hated the move.
Actually, the study is to see if it's possible to implant a false memory about committing a crime.
I had colleagues saying, this isn't going to work. There's no way you will get individuals to think that they committed a crime that never happened.
She begins with a true event gathered from their parents. In this case, a family move.
We moved around like every year kind of thing.
But this was just a trick to gain trust. The next step is to introduce the false memory, a fight so severe that the police were called.
So the other event which your parents reported happening was when you were 14 years old, you initiated a physical fight and the police called your parents. They said it happened in Kelowna in the fall. And you were with Ryan when it happened?
Only 2 of the details are real. The name of the best friend and the place she lived at the time. The rest is made up.
Honestly, I don't remember. I don't know what you're talking about. I feel like I don't think I've ever been in a fight. I'm so confused.
Shaw then turns to a series of cognitive techniques known to induce false memories, starting with an imagination exercise.
I'd like you to relax, close your eyes, and focus your attention on trying to retrieve this.
Okay.
Bolstered with a little social pressure,
This might seem a bit strange, but it does work for most people. Subtly introducing this notion that it works for most people if they try hard enough, which is a subtle form of social manipulation.
And asks the participant to visualize certain details of the stories.
Introducing things that are easy to picture first. Picture yourself at the age of 14. Picture yourself at the age of 14. That's an easy thing to picture. In Kelowna. In Kelowna, the place that she lives, that she lived at the age. Also easy to picture. And it's fall. It's fall. Everybody can picture fall. And you were with Ryan when it happened.
When people imagine events that might have occurred in their past, we know that that's a potent way of creating false memory.
After giving the memory a week to set, she brings the participant back.
Okay, so welcome back. And so by the time we get to interview number 2, we're seeing a different story.
Remember, like a verbal fight, and maybe I seems so unlike, but maybe I pushed for something.
Good, okay. So this is where she's first fully buying into this idea that she's actually had a fight.
I feel like she pushed me first.
Okay. And this person is starting to picture how it could have happened. And what could have been turns into what would have been, turns into what was.
So by the third interview, the memory has taken hold.
I think the cops showed up and we were kind of having maybe a verbal kind of fight, and then it kind of maybe got to a push.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't just this once. Shaw was able to convince over 70% of participants that they committed a crime.
I think I just lost it. I couldn't take that anymore.
Okay. I was incredibly surprised at the rate that I had in terms of successfully implanting these false memories. Can you physically feel things in the memory?
Yes.
And yet there we were, and it just kept coming and coming and coming.
So much so, Shaw's team cut the study short.
So this is a false memory study.
I'm so embarrassed.
And the ramifications go way beyond fooling college students. False memory studies like this question one of the cornerstones of the criminal justice system.
Okay. So, that was some footage from the original study. The producers really liked this woman because she looks really innocent. There were some other participants who I think had much more interesting stories. I had Chantel, who had about 150 details of this crime that she had allegedly committed, and she reenacted throwing this rock at a love rival of hers. And essentially this rock, every time she told the story, got bigger and bigger, and it got heavier, it seemed, as she was reenacting it. But she talked about things like, and then I was sitting at the dinner table when the police came, and they buzzed the doorbell, and one was standing on the lower step, and one was standing on the higher step, and one of them was, I think, a bit Hispanic. The level of detail with some of these memories is astonishing. And when we see the ramifications for this for the criminal justice system as it ends, when we see that people can falsely confess to crimes that they didn't commit, this is a really, really small situation. My research study, my lab, when psychologists talk about labs, usually they talk about their offices. I don't know if you noticed, if you were paying attention, there's two things in that video. One is a Tim Hortons cup. If you've been to Canada, Tim Hortons is a really famous Canadian bakery chain, and they make coffee. The other thing was a tiny Freud doll in the background waving. Essentially, I had props also in my bookcase with regression, repression, uncovering lost childhood memories to really make it seem like they're in a place where they can uncover these allegedly lost memories. Why this matters is because for your personal life, like my aunt, it's possible to misremember potentially important memories of your life. In work contexts, you can also misremember potentially important events. Things like harassment or discrimination, inappropriate experiences at work, Things like that can also be misremembered potentially, and it's really important to preserve original records of these kinds of experiences, lest accidentally they change. For the criminal justice system, I mean, if you're in a courtroom and you're telling a story like this, and you're telling it full of emotion and full of detail, you're probably going to get convicted. And that's a really problematic thing. Now, if you're an eyewitness, similarly, if you get it wrong, this can have really serious repercussions. Luckily, in everyday life, you don't need to remember all the details of everything you've done. It doesn't matter whether someone is wearing a blue jacket or a red jacket. It doesn't matter whether the color of these lights is purple or red or green. It has no repercussions whatsoever for your life. In fact, you could argue that a perfect memory system, most of the time, is a bad thing. There are people who are called highly superior autobiographical memory individuals, HSAMs. They're people who can remember with incredible detail their personal life. You can open up Tagebücher, journals, and say, on February 2nd, 1987, what did you have for breakfast? And they'll be able to tell you. Even these people who have this sort of memory superpower, of which there only seem to be about 200 in the world, by the way, and you're probably not one of them. If you're thinking, my memory is exceptional, probably overconfident. But these people generally say that they wish they wouldn't be able to remember so much. Why? They seem unhappy with the ability, for one, people repeat themselves a lot. Would you really love your significant other quite as much if you remembered his stories even better? People are really good at telling the same story over and over again, and that gets really boring if you can remember them all perfectly. But more importantly, it seems to also matter that we generally decrease, especially the emotional impact of negative memories over time. Generally, we look back over our lives and think that we've had a pretty good life. If you remember everything perfectly, you don't have as much that feeling, that bias that we normally do. It also seems that generally the brain, even though these false memories seem like really problematic things, the brain is there for abstraction. It's built to take the real world with all its complexity and distill it into small, manageable, useful pieces of information that can be used to problem solve in the present and to deal with the future. It's not really made to remember things perfectly. And so when it does remember things perfectly, that can also be a problem. But from time to time, it matters. And my advice to you is that when you have something, a piece of information that you know where precision matters, where this particular red jacket, I'm going to need to remember that it's red, and my brain might not do that. Write it down, record it, take a picture. Don't trust your brain. Assume you're going to forget. Best piece of advice I think anyone will give you about memory. Assume you're going to forget. Write it down if it's really important. So, the future of memory. How do we go further, and what does this have to do with technology? Digital amnesia. Ooh. I get asked this question all the time. Julia, is Google making us dumber? What do you think? Maybe. My answer is we don't really know, but we do know that, for example, taking a picture of something instead of paying attention to something means that your brain is likely to say, I don't need to remember this because I have a picture of it. I recently had a conversation with a friend who was like, yeah, I get that. When I go through my phone, I have all these screenshots of things. I don't even remember what they are or why I made the screenshot. Clearly, it's something that you've told your brain, I should remember this later. But your brain says, I don't need to remember this at all because you've screenshotted it and stored it in your photos. So the photos themselves, you still need to have a way of organizing them. But ultimately, outsourcing memory can mean that the physical representation of memory in your brain is weakened. So if you want to also remember it, you need to also pay attention and try to make a memory trace beyond the photo. So there is this issue that if we take photos, we seem to say, I don't need to remember that. Our brains are lazy. The other thing that happens is that Google does change the way that we remember things. Another conversation, actually more of a heated argument that I had with someone recently, he was a teacher. And he said, as a teacher, I get really frustrated that kids these days, you pretty much lose me immediately when you say this, by the way. Kids these days. Yeah, sure, Grandpa. But kids these days, they don't remember things like the capital city of every country in the world anymore. They just Google it. And that's a problem, he said. And I said, I don't know, is it? Because you can just Google it. Now, there's a positive and a negative. The positive is that for one, you still need to know the concepts. You still need to know there are countries, you still need to know that there are capital cities, and you still need to know that there's Google. Because you need to put something into Google. So you still need search terms. You can't get away with remembering nothing. But from that point on, there is, of course, the potential. So the positive is that you free up resources to learn other things. You don't need to sit there memorizing things that are already recorded elsewhere much more reliably. But of course, this opens us up to what? To interference. So if people go and change things on the internet, luckily, usually it's a self-correcting process, but we know there's a lot of garbage online. And this can infiltrate if we then search for that information and potentially give us wrong information that we might have not had if we'd actually learned facts ourselves. So the good and the bad, I think generally it's just how it's changing. And I think what impact this is having on our memories is that essentially we're outsourcing more and more, and it's freeing up our ability to learn things like critical thinking, to learn things like concepts, and to figure out how all these pieces fit together rather than the minutia detail of what those different things actually are. So I think this potentially is really freeing up humanity to look at much more construct level thinking. But there is also a risk. So digital amnesia is an issue. From online lie to offline memory, here's another thing that's happening, is you're forgetting what you look like. So there was a research study which showed that, well, let's go through the research study. Pretend you're my participant. You're coming into my research study, and I take a picture of your face. Snap. I now say, go for coffee, come back in half an hour. Now, while you're away having coffee, what I do is I Photoshop your photo of your face to be more attractive and less attractive in 5% increments. So what happens is you come back, and now there's 20 pictures, all different versions of your face. For those of you who are self-conscious about your face, this is not a good study for you. But you come in, I lay these 20 photos out in front of you, and I say, which is the original? Now, which one do you pick? On average, you'll pick a photo that is about 15% more attractive than you actually are. In other words, you are 15% uglier than you think you are. You're welcome. Didn't think I'd insult you today, did you? So you pick one that's on average about 15% more attractive. Now, the researchers who did this study did one more thing. They said, I'm going to ask friends and family members of this person to come in and do the same thing. Pick the unretouched photo. And they picked the right one. So you might be uglier than you think you are, but your friends and family love you anyway. And they know what you look like. So why do you not know what your own face looks like? And why do friends and family know what it looks like? Now, the researchers speculate that perhaps this is because you've hacked your own memory. Now, what this means is that think about the photos that you post over the mantelpiece at grandma's, or more recently, post as your profile picture, or post as photos on Instagram, or use on Twitter, or whatever media you use. Do you think that's an average photo of your face? Or do you think it's about 15% more attractive than you actually are? Or more, perhaps. The researchers suggest that perhaps if you upload these photos and look at these photos of yourself often enough, you actually end up distorting your own view of what your face looks like. Essentially, you believe your own lie. You go, oh, that's what I look like, because that's what I've told myself I look like. Whereas your friends and family see you, and they go, no, those photos are not representative. Now, I think the take-home message from this is we need to be careful how we use the internet. There is tremendous potential for other people to influence your memory through social processes, through things like fake news to have an impact on your worldview. But there's also tremendous potential for yourself to have a long-term impact on how you remember your life. Think about your Facebook timeline as your personal journal, which is really what it is. When you go back and look over your life and your photos, hopefully you haven't just selected these moments based on the most amount of likes they're going to get. Hopefully you've actually filtered out some of these events to be things that are actually meaningful to you. Because when you look back, everything that you photographed, everything that you've recorded in these kinds of processes, you're going to reinforce. You're going to better remember these particular things. And you're going to potentially forget the things that you didn't record. So make sure that whatever it is you're curating online actually is meaningful to you. Because probably in the future, that's what you think your life was, or that's what you will think your life was. And yeah, be careful when you lie to yourself and others that you don't believe your own lies. Or if you do, realize that you're potentially changing your own view of yourself. My favorite quote in line with this is a Kurt Vonnegut quote: "We are what we pretend to be, so we must be careful what we pretend to be." People always take pictures of this one. Kurt Vonnegut, great science fiction writer, really easy reads if you're interested in that kind of thing. Now, Memory 2.0. Where is this taking us, and what can we do to overcome some of the shortfalls that happen? The flexibility, the false memories, the issues with potentially distorting our own past. How do we get around that by using technology? My most recent project involves using tech to overcome the limitations of memory. I essentially, for about 10 years, have talked about how terrible your memory is. And I usually just go, "Goodbye, your memory's terrible, good luck everyone," and I leave. And that's me. Now, at some point, I got fed up with being the problem, and I wanted to actually present part of the solution. And so I've been working on creating AI tools that help us remember things better. And I'm just putting this slide up because I think it's true for everything. AI changes everything. AI changes your brain. AI changes your interactions with humans. AI changes the very essence of what it means to be human. In fact, at some point, you might not even be human. At least if Elon has his way, which he probably won't. Hopefully, maybe, we'll see. Social commentary. I always feel like whenever I talk about Elon Musk, I'm probably going to get a bunch of internet trolls. But bring it, bring it. AI changes everything. I think AI is going to profoundly change the way we remember. And I think it's going to do it through tools like Spot. Spot is a tool that helps you record and report workplace harassment and discrimination by using a chatbot. Essentially, what I'm trying to create and what some other people are trying to create is a way to have a memory interviewer in your pocket. So that if something emotional happens or important happens that you want to record, how do you make sure that you're recording all the relevant details and doing it as quickly as possible? And so here's another video that explains what Spot is. And given that this is an HR tool, this might be of particular interest to you because it's a direct application of memory science to HR. So if we could dim the lights, können wir das Licht wieder runterschalten? Bitte? Nein? Doch? Vielleicht? Licht? Danke. Here's a 2-minute video.
Spot is a tool that uses memory science and artificial intelligence to help people record and report workplace harassment and discrimination.
Why would somebody go to a chatbot to report sexual harassment and not a human or a friend or their own email?
People find it really awkward to talk to a human being about harassment. They're not sure if something actually counts as harassment sometimes. They also sometimes aren't sure if they want to escalate something right away, and they might want to sit on it for a while.
You can talk to this bot and make a detailed log of what's happened, and the bot's hopefully asking you questions that you may not think of on your own that HR could ask you down the line.
It's actually based on best practices in police interviewing, which is open questions, non-leading questions. It makes sure that you get as much information as possible, information that can be easy to miss, and then puts it on paper.
Give me an example of a question that the chatbot might ask me.
Were there witnesses? Is there other evidence that you have that this happened? What time and date did this exactly happen?
How do you see somebody using it and then bringing it forward?
They start their anonymous chat right away. Then they can learn about harassment and discrimination, but more importantly, they can immediately record what happened. It walks you through all the details. Then you get a PDF record that you can keep for yourself. Now at this point, you can decide to keep that and to maybe wait to see if something happens again, because sometimes the first time something happens, you might go, oh, actually, I'm not ready to report this. But if it happens again, you might now say, actually, it's time to go to HR and tell somebody about this. You're essentially building a case that in case you need that evidence later, you're ready.
How come you did this? Was there something personal that happened to you?
Okay, so that's Spot. Spot allows you can go to Spot right now if you want, talktospot.com. Spot helps employees speak up about harassment and discrimination. It gives them a perfect memory interviewer. And it also allows employers and HR to immediately respond even to anonymous complaints and to manage their case better. So if you want to talk about Spot, I'd love to talk to you. Come talk to me after this, potentially also during my book signing. So it also allows you to follow up. Now, memory hacking, the last piece of advice I'm going to leave you with before we part ways and you go enjoy the rest of this wonderful conference or come talk to me. The best piece of advice I think I can give you is that if you want to remember something right away, sure, record it, write it down. But the other thing is that if you want to remember it in your brain, try to, for example, make your memory as multisensory as possible. You're trying to remember someone's name, for example, at this conference. You're trying to remember that that's Steve. Hi, Steve. Normally what happens is you don't pay attention and the name is gone within seconds. You haven't even really captured the name and you've already forgotten it. Now, how do you change that? One thing to do is actually pay attention, actually be in the moment, be sort of like a Buddhist, be in the moment. And say, yes, Steve, and then repeat it to yourself and then build it out. Steve with the big ears, potentially. Or Steve, and then picture Steve doing something absurd. Picture it. What does Steve smell like? What does he look like? What does he feel like? Try to make as big a memory trace as possible. And if you're interested in this, there's a really good book on it called Moonwalking with Einstein by Joshua Foer, who spent a year becoming a memory grandmaster, someone who's exceptional at remembering names and numbers and other things. A quote I will leave you with: memory is like a Wikipedia page. Constructive, reconstructive, you can go in there and change it, but so can other people. This is by one of my academic heroes, Elizabeth Loftus. You can find all my research at my website if you want. You can also find out about my book and come talk to me back there right now. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Julia. No, you stay here. We'll have the book signing after.
Oh, we've got questions, sorry.
A few Q&As.
Not running away.
But first of all, thanks a lot. I hope I recall it right, and that you didn't induce any false memory, but that was a very inspiring talk. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Let me kick off the discussion and then I'll open up for questions for you. There's a more conventional technology that helps us to hack our memory, and that's taking notes. Mm-hmm. Why do we need technology in order to do it? Every recording technology that humanity has developed in the last 5,000 years, I imagine, has done the trick. Why do we need now AI?
You know, ancient philosophers apparently when we started writing on tablets, so writing down things at all rather than telling oral history, philosophers used to say that people are going to start forgetting things because we're writing them down on tablets. We're essentially carving things into stone, and that's going to be problematic for our memories. So I think there's always been concerns about it. But I think what technology can do, which a note can't, is that it's really easy to not realize what the important details are of something. Mm-hmm. And especially if you're emotional, you're maybe not thinking in a coherent, clear way right away. And so it can help to have an interactive, almost conversation. And so that's why I think a chatbot or a tool like that is useful for helping us remember.
When turning your research work into a startup, you've chosen the topic of discrimination in job interviews. Why that one? I mean, for example, the other field that you've been describing, how witnesses in courts suffer under a false memory, might be a much broader field. My wife is a judge, so I'm personally
certainly
sort of biased that might have been let's say a bigger field, or a field of bigger importance, maybe.
Both of those things. It's more important and it's a bigger field to apply this to crime. But creating a chatbot for the police and creating it for crime is an absolutely massive undertaking.
Yeah.
For one, the laws in every country are very different as to what constitutes a crime, even in England, even in America, even within the same country, never mind in the UK or in Canada. And the other thing is the emotional content varies dramatically, because everything from a bicycle theft to a murder has to be captured then by the same tool potentially, which would take a decade probably to create properly. So the reason we focused on harassment and discrimination is because in the light of Me Too, actually, I met my co-founders the week that Uber broke. The Uber scandal, do you remember that? Before #MeToo was a thing. We met that weekend, and what we noticed is that people really wanted to speak up about this issue, didn't know how, the current reporting mechanisms were broken, and often they're relying entirely on their memories. And as I show in my research, these memories can be problematic, they can be incorrect. So how do you build a strong case, and how do you overcome and prevent false memories from happening? And so that's why we created this chatbot for harassment and discrimination, because it's an emotional issue, it's a specific space, specific relationships, and it's something that where often memories are really, really, really important. And so that's why we created it.
Thanks. What are your questions? And if you don't feel comfortable to ask them in English, please ask them in German. Right here in front. Okay.
Hi, Julia. Thank you very much for your inputs. What do you think, how can critical thinking contribute to a less false memory? I wouldn't like to say to a right memory, because this is a philosophical question maybe, to a less false memory.
How can critical thinking help us have fewer false memories? Or is it how can we spot false memories with critical thinking?
How can our critical thinking contribute to a less false memory? I'm touching another wording, which is the beliefs.
Yeah.
Our beliefs and our memories, and in between, maybe critical thinking as a methodology can contribute to a more accurate, less false memory. It's my question, just a hypothetical one.
I think the best thing first of all, I think that we need to teach much better critical thinking skills to children. Step one. And then also to adults, but to children first. Because I think the best thing to ward off false memories and potentially false beliefs as well is being able to appreciate what good evidence means. And so having an empirical mind and being able to say, this is good evidence and this is bad evidence. This conspiracy theory, not so good. This academic paper, probably better. Even there, how do I evaluate that paper? So I think that critical thinking can help us look for appropriate evidence, which can combat, if we do have beliefs, we look for, where does it come from, why is it this way, and how do I deal with it, and potentially correct it if it's wrong.
Unless the paper is part of a conspiracy.
Yeah. Well, that's the problem with conspiracy theories. They're so easy to maintain. Any other questions?
Don't take it wrong, I'm not a conspiracy theorist. What are other questions? This is right here. Thanks.
Now that we know that it's difficult to trust our memories, and if I'm making the case for HR, an example, we have a candidate for interviews and so on, how can we, if we know that the memories that the candidate are reporting are imperfect, maybe he's only reporting the very positive experience that he has in the past, how can you go deep and maybe try to correlate and through other ways verify that what he or she is saying is accurate to the extent of what you can achieve during an interview?
How can you validate memories or see whether things are accurate in HR contexts? Excellent question. First of all, I'm going to insult you again. You're bad at detecting lies. All of you, you're bad at it. We all think we're really good at it. We're really bad at it. Human beings suck at detecting lies. So the first thing you don't do is assume if someone tells you about harassment, discrimination, or anything else, you don't assume they're lying because they're acting a bit funny. But you can look for the quality of their evidence. So you can look for things. So if I'm asked, for example, in a courtroom to evaluate whether, more extreme cases, but to evaluate whether things may be false, I look at how that memory has come up. And things like delay aren't necessarily a sign at all that something isn't correct. But things like talking to lots of other people, potentially not having records, those for me are potentially problematic in terms of substantiating claims, at least. So I think that in a one-to-one situation, what you can do is ask for things like, what evidence do you have? Did you tell anyone at the time? And this is what Spot does as well, is were there any witnesses? Because that can be helpful to further corroborate what happened. Again, that doesn't mean that just because someone doesn't have emails or doesn't have witnesses that they're making it up at all. But it can further strengthen the case, at least, if they have these things. So I think the best thing you can do is not assume that you know when people are lying. Don't ask leading questions. You shouldn't do this, the police shouldn't do this, therapists shouldn't do this. It must have been really emotional. What else? I mean, what else happened would be fine. But things like, was it Stephen? Did he also do this? Did she also do this? Note that Spot isn't just for sexual harassment, it's for all kinds of harassment. But in terms of these kinds of questions, try to stay neutral and fact-finding. And also, maybe if the person's coming to you for support, you're also not a therapist. So be careful with that as well. Don't be too empathetic, because having really high empathy has also been shown to increase the propensity for people to add details to their stories that might not actually be true. So you want to stay quite neutral, but helpful, and be there for the person. And don't assume they're lying. Never assume they're lying.
Thanks. Time for one or two more questions. Any more questions?
In the back.
In the very back. All right. Yeah. Meet in the middle.
Hello. So now we all know about fake memories, but what example or what answer give you to people who have false memory, like your Aunt Elisabeth or Ilse, like your Aunt Ilse? What do we say to people that are really, really wrong about something?
Good question. So it can be difficult to get rid of false memories. I have false memories. I study false memories, and I have false memories, for sure. I have a memory of being one, and I think I used this as an example earlier, but this is my fake memory, of meeting my grandfather, him picking me up, twirling me around, and I'm 1 year old. First of all, I can't have a memory from 1 year old. You don't have memories before the age of 2. Second of all, he wouldn't have been strong enough. Third of all, I never met him at that age. Like, totally wrong. But every time I think about my grandfather, I think about this memory. I just know it didn't happen. Now, how do I get rid of it? I probably don't get rid of the picture, because what happens when you tell people that their memories are false, typically, it doesn't mean that they've then completely erased that memory. Just like if someone tells you that you read something instead of watched a movie about it or read a news article about it, you don't erase that information. You just change the label. So they become what are called non-believed memories. It's a memory that you know didn't happen, but you still kind of have it as a recollection. I think the best way to get people convinced that their memories are false, if you know that they are, is to present them with evidence to the contrary. Again, that can be difficult to do, and sometimes they won't accept it. But most of the time, I think people do, when faced with contradictory evidence, go, you know what? Maybe I am wrong. And then they can update their belief. So look for evidence. Back to critical thinking and evidence.
Oh, last question. Back. Yes, please.
Yeah, hello. I would like to give a part. You speak of false memory. and your story of your auntie is a proven fact then, because you can tell her, okay, you weren't in Basel, you were in Cologne at that time. But we all live in stories. The big question is, what is reality? Yeah? If what you spoke about the human brain, everyone has his own story and everyone is living in this story. And memory is always a part of a bigger picture. Like the blind people who try to find out what the elephant is. The one who is coming at, yeah. And I have a problem with this word false, because if you speak of people having false memories, they will come to feel themselves being false in the picture. If you tell people to have a part of the picture, then they can include themselves always in a bigger part. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that there's. I mean, false memories is the academic term that we use to describe memories of things that didn't happen to you. Now, this can be partial false memories. A lot of false memories aren't a whole event. They're a part of something that you did experience, but that part is incorrect or you didn't experience it. So it's false in that it wasn't part of your original reality. Now, whether it's now the term I like, and that actually was coined by somebody else, is the term memory thief. So in my Tante Ilse's case, Tante Ilse, she was a memory thief. She stole someone else's real memory. So it's a real memory in and of itself. It's just false to her. And so that's something but we call them false memories because they're not an accurate representation of something that you experienced. Not necessarily because the facts that this thing happened are incorrect, although you could very much argue that it's factually inaccurate that my aunt was there. So even that is false. But that's how we talk about it normally.
Thanks.
Great.
Let me close with a personal question. How does it feel to be so tricky and mean in your experiments with these poor students that you trick into something and then they probably don't feel very well when you've manipulated them in that meaningful way as we've seen in the videos?
Oh, it's super fun. No, just kidding. I don't just do this for fun. I do it because I think it's really important to be able to have this evidence to show how things can go wrong. It feels, honestly, I didn't realize I'd be so good at lying to students.
Okay.
Because, I lied to them about everything. I lied to them about evidence. I lied to them about the event. I lied to them about the memory techniques. But ultimately, I think it's more ethical to implant false memories of negative events than false memories of positive events. Okay. The reason for that is, at the end of these studies, and this is, I think, what you're touching on, when I tell my participants that this didn't actually happen, they're relieved. They're like, oh, thank God. They might initially feel tricked, but ultimately I think it's a good life lesson. But if I were to take away a really positive experience, convince someone they ran a marathon or won an award, and 3 weeks later say, just kidding, they might feel really bad about themselves. And so I think it's actually easier to restore the original sort of feeling of that person and mental health of that person if you take away a negative one than if you take away a positive one.
Okay.
So anyway, that's how I justify it to myself, at least.
But it also means that you're a natural liar, right?
Well, not necessarily.
Not necessarily. What we all sensed is that we had a natural scientist here and definitely a natural speaker. Thanks a lot, Julia, that you've been here. And now you all get the chance to talk to Julia in person right back there and in the booth for the books. And if you're interested in buying a copy of her book, Das trügerische Gedächtnis, it'll be signed back there, right behind you. Thanks a lot for your attention. We'll be right back in about 15 minutes with the next talk. Thanks a lot.